have to work from the small iPad. The struggle is real. Name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. We're up to chapter 27 of the book of Acts, and I'm sorry, we won't be able to finish 2 chapters today. That was only last week. Chapter 27 is basically St. Paul begins his journey now to Rome. After he appealed to Caesar, we will see him now being sent home, or being sent to Rome. But the one thing that we will start seeing that is slightly different, throughout the book of Acts, we saw St. Paul as a preacher, as a theologian. In this chapter, we're going to see him as a Christian person, someone who's truly living Christianity, a normal person, who has to deal with problems, who is going to face challenges. You're going to see the challenge today. They're going to be on a ship between life and death. A bit like life. Life, we always seem like we're in the middle of the sea, and there will be circumstances in life where we are being tossed around and very little control do we have or we can do with our life. And this is going to be the scenario we're going to see St. Paul in. And see him in the middle of the sea and in the ship. And St. Luke, who's writing the book of Acts, is accompanying him. And you'll see St. Paul use imagery, words such as we were just carried by the sea. That's it. The ship, they had no control over the ship, and they're just being tossed and carried by the sea without any kind of navigation. Sometimes we, as Christians, face these issues, and this is what we're going to experience and see St. Paul dealing with these circumstances as a Christian person. And what we will learn and what we can really observe is we will see him as a practical man. Practical man when he faces situations that are urgent or that are unexpected. He is going to face them without any fear and without any hesitation. And this is actually quite nice because this is going to remind us or give us an imagery, the same as we see in the Old Testament, the likes of our father Abraham, just before he went to rescue his cousin Lot. These saints, when they face what I could say normal problems, we find them that they stand firm. You're going to see again the way that St. Paul stands. And it's going to be really easy to work out that he actually supplicated himself in prayer for the sake of it, and not for the sake of himself. That he faced these uncertain times with prayer, to the extent that eventually the angel of the Lord, which is God himself, is going to stand in front of him. So send him his angel. He's going to tell him, you're going to be okay, and not just you. I'm going to spare everybody that is in the ship, and we'll see that happening to him. The importance of this journey that is about to happen, this is a journey to Rome. And this is the journey where evangelism is going to be, instead of being to the Jews, it is who are rejecting Christ. It's going to the capital city of the Gentiles, capital city of the rest of the world at that time, so that the Christian message can be granted or gifted to all of humanity. Start with verse 1. And when it was, name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coasts of Asia. Aristocratus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. Julius, we learn, is a Roman officer who was actually assigned to look after St. Paul. Obviously, he had to remain very close to Paul and the other prisoners that are with him at all times. But we'll find that through this contact between Julius and St. Paul, Julius is going to develop a lot of respect to St. Paul. This is the true Christian. I said to you, we're going to see him now as a Christian person. Not a preacher, not the theologian that we've seen throughout the book of Acts. It's just a Christian person. And through this interaction between him and Julius, we're going to see Julius develop a lot of respect to St. Paul. And therefore, we see him here giving St. Paul a certain amount of freedom. And later on, towards the end of the chapter, is actually going to spare his life. St. Luke, and this is where I said to you, it is very obvious that St. Luke is with St. Peter and his group of prisoners with Julius in the Augustan regiment. You see him, St. Paul, here using words as the next day we landed at Sidon. We really trying to tell us that St. Paul was actually with them. Obviously, they went to these two cities, and one of the ways that ships used to travel, ship was probably the quickest way to Rome, and one of the ways that ships used to travel is they used to travel along the coastline from port to port, and that would be the way that they travel through the Mediterranean. And this is why we see St. Luke tell us here that they went to Sidon. From Sidon, they are going to go from one city to the other. So they went first to this city called Adramyttium, and then following that they go to Sidon. Verse 4. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea which is off Sicilia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy and put us on board. So what you see here, St. Luke is basically giving us a bit of an itinerary of how they're traveling, and it's obvious that they are traveling along the coastline from port to port until they found a city from Alexandria, a ship from Alexandria. Alexandria or Egypt was the source of where the wheat used to come to Italy or to Rome. So these ships used to be huge ships that were carrying a lot of supplies, that is wheat, and the centurion obviously wanting to get Paul there as soon as possible, they bought this ship to take them towards Rome. Verse 7, when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cyndius, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete of Salmon. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Laissa. Now, when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul, and because the harbour was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to sail from there also by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbour of Crete opening towards the southwest and northwest, and winter there. Greek ships in ancient times didn't have compasses. And like I said to you, they either sailed along the shoreline from port to port, or if they had to cross the sea, they would use the stars and navigate using the stars to know the direction in which they are traveling. Now, the problem with overcast weather, which they called winter, is that winter would make it impossible for the sailor to see the stars, which meant it would nearly impossible to navigate. And therefore, crossing during the winter would be quite a dangerous and risky voyage to take. And what becomes very obvious here, if you look at St. Paul actually advised them. It says to us here, because of the fast was already over, this fast that was over is the fast that used to actually occur between September, 25th of September to the 10th of October. It's called the fast of the kafara in the Jewish tradition. I can't remember the English word for it. But during that period, they actually used to winter. They used to stop traveling. They used to stop crossing because of the winds, because of the weather, because of all these things. But what becomes very obvious to us here is because Paul had spent so much time traveling, he had a lot of experience in the sea. And here St. Paul says to them, I perceive that is me, my logic, my experience. It's not a vision that has come to St. Paul, but St. Paul is basically saying to them, from my experience, it is best not to sail. But the owner of the boat and the captain of the boat had a problem. And the problem is, this is, like I said to you, is a very big ship. And the port that they're at is not suitable to winter, which means to allow this ship to sit throughout winter in that port. So what they did, and the centurion obviously listened to the experience of the owner and the captain, more than St. Paul. St. Luke says to us here, the centurion didn't know Paul well enough, so he didn't listen to the experience of St. Paul. He listened to the owner and the captain, even though their decision may have been influenced by the fact that they couldn't winter there and they wanted to reach at all costs a port where they could winter, that is where they could sit and wait for this period of winter to pass through. In verse 12, it actually tells us the reasoning for the decision of these owner and the captain, and that's because the owner didn't want to spend that time in the city that's called Fair Haven, so they took their chances and disregarded Paul's advice. And then that we'll see what they're going to experience. Verse 13, when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to the sea, they sailed close by Crete, but not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive, and running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on Syrtis sands, they struck sail, so we were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. What does this sound like? Disaster. Sounds like life. Yes? We can see here St. Luke describing to us all the measures that the sailors took to try and survive. Included binding ropes. Ships at the time didn't have metal, and they used to keep all the boards together with these ropes. So binding the ropes means reinforcing the ship so that as it's being hit by the waves, it doesn't fall apart. This, what you could see, this skiff, which is like a rescue boat, to manage to actually get it onto the ship with difficulty. They obviously managed to get it there, and they also secured it as their last chance of survival should the big ship go under. And then as they got lost, and you see here St. Luke actually describing it, we were driven makhalas. We had no control over the boat. We were in the hands of air. We were in the absolute hands of the sea. And all they were doing to try and survive is they threw overboard what they're carrying, the stock, the wheat. It says to us here, when they had taken, after the cables, they were worried about two things. They were worried about that they get stuck in the sands, which obviously existed, or that the ship will fall apart. So they lightened up the ship, lightening up the load that is throwing stock, the wheat they were carrying, obviously into the sea. Or the next day they actually also threw all the tackle overboard to try and survive, to try and find a way of coping with it. Now St. Luke goes out of his way to describe this wind to us. And he actually, in verse 15, he tells us the name of the wind. So when the ship was caught and could not lead into the wind, we let her driven. Verse 14. The wind's name was the Euroclydon wind. And this Euroclydon wind is known as a wind that was cyclonic. It's a wind that can destroy the ship because it goes in all different directions. And this kind of wind can take the ship off its course. And this is why St. Paul says to us here, and this is a beautiful, St. Luke says to us these words in verse 14. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. Let her drive. Makhalas. We had nothing. We had to err. We had to leave things in God's hands. It's a beautiful verse for us to learn from. Because sometimes it feels through life that we are going through that very similar, what is it called again? Euroclydon wind. There's a storm going from every direction and we can't see a solution. Yeah? Sometimes life feels like that. We have absolutely no control. And what is important in these kind of scenarios, we need to be like St. Luke here, where he says to us, what could we do other than leave everything in God's hands? St. Paul here, when he says, St. Luke, when he says to us here, we let her drive, it means we left everything in God's hands. These difficulties that can sometimes face us in life, when we find that there is very little we can do about these difficulties, there's nothing wrong in leaving it in God's hands. Knowing that His hand carries us. His hand protects us. And this is not laziness. This is not absent-mindedness. This is not giving up, which sometimes people do. If you notice here, St. Luke goes out of his way to tell us that they did everything they physically can. And that's what my role is in life, to do everything I can in the face of these difficulties. If I can work, I'll work. If I can solve, I'll solve. If I can labor, I'll labor. I'll do everything I can, but I'll leave it in the hands of God. Because a lot of the time, some people misunderstand this verse and say, we're going to leave it in God's hands. What am I going to do? I'm going to go home and I'm going to sleep. I'm not going to do anything. That's not leaving it in God's hands. That's being reckless. Leaving it in God's hands means I do everything I physically can, everything God has gifted me to be able to do. I do everything to deal with the problem that I know how to deal with the problem, but I leave it in God's hands, knowing that I am protected in His hands, and He is the all-merciful God that will only allow what is best for me in my life. And this is why this verse is one of those verses that you can really, really take home from the book of Acts. You see these saints, St. Luke and St. Paul, leaving it in God's hands. Obviously, St. Luke then describes to us all the measures that they took to try and survive, whether it be through binding the ropes under the ship to hold it together, or to try and avoid this wind, or to empty the stock, or to throw away the tackle. These were all ways to try and survive. But towards the end of verse 20, St. Luke tells us pretty much that they were truly in the hand of God. Why? Because there was many days where they didn't see the stars, they didn't see the sun. It means they truly didn't know where they were. And this is going to become more and more obvious in the next few verses. Verse 21. But after long abstinence from food, Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete, incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar. And indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, and that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Look at the beauty of St. Paul. Now the first thing that St. Luke tells us is the first thing that St. Paul's reaction was, No, before that I told you so. First words of verse 21. No. Fasting. Look at the saints, how they react. They did everything they can. They didn't just secure the boat. They didn't just throw overboard stock. They didn't St. Paul. What was St. Paul doing? Fasting. Fasting after a long period of abstinence from food. after fasting. So obviously St. Paul was fasting and was praying. Why? Because as he was praying, the angel of the Lord came and spoke to him. So it is in these times, and I think I was saying this, I don't know if I said it at the camp or I said it last week. I think it was at the camp. When someone was asking the question of the relationship that saints create with God, and whether this relationship only happens at the end of their life. And I said to that person, it's a relationship throughout life. But it is during these very difficult times. I use the example of the three saintly youth. If you go back at the beginning of their life as young children, you could say they were in difficult circumstances, couldn't you? Pretty difficult. They were kidnapped. Can I use the word kidnapped? Yeah. They were prisoners of war. Worse than kidnapping. They were taken away from their land to a foreign land to live with a foreign king who was trying to force them to live his way. As young men, what did they do? They said, no, I'm sorry, we're going to fast. We're not going to eat that food of yours. We're going to fast. I said to them, no, you need to eat the food so you can be strong. I said, okay, you feed your men your food, we will eat our food, and let's see who's going to be stronger. So the relationship of these men with God was strong. But the temptation, the waves of the sea get harder and harder until they're having to be thrown into a fire. What happens in the fire? They see God. And sometimes these difficult circumstances that can occur in our life, this ship that we can find ourselves suddenly in the middle of the sea, where it's being driven by the sea and we've done everything we can and there's very little we can do about the ship. This is where we experience God. We need to do everything we can, not give up. Leave it in God's hands. Do our work. What is our work? What is St. Paul doing? Fasting and praying. In fasting and praying, what happens? He receives the answer. Yes, he does say, I told you so. Obviously, I told you so. But even though I told you so, he says to them in verse 22, be careful. Do not take heart. Do not become depressed. Do not give up. Everything is going to be okay. Why? Because I saw God. I saw the angel. God came and spoke to me. And there will be no loss. You know why? Because I wasn't just praying for me. I was praying for all of us. I remember trying to remember who said it, but I remember once, it was at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when people were starting to predict that this is the end of the world. One of the church fathers, I can't remember who, it's one of the bishops in Egypt, came out and said, for as long as we have saints in our monasteries praying, God will spare the world. See, there's a saint on this ship. Saint who? St. Paul. And St. Paul was praying for himself and for everybody on this ship. And here we see the angel of God coming to him and saying to him, you will be spared, you and everybody on this ship, because this is everybody that you're praying for. Imagine if this is the strength of St. Paul's prayer while he was on the ship. Can you imagine the strength of his prayer now when he's in heaven, if we actually intercede through him? And keeping in mind that all these other people on this ship were pagan. They didn't believe in God. And these pagan gods didn't have angels that they could send or that could prophesy with the future. But God himself. And this is why St. Paul goes to them, the angel of the God to whom I belong. Not your gods, My God. The God to whom I belong. I'm jumping in verses. Verse 23. The God to whom I belong. This is the God whose angel came and appeared. I belong to him, yes. I have dedicated myself to him. This is a beautiful verse where St. Paul says, I have actually dedicated every aspect. I actually belong to him. It reminds me of the verse that St. Mary uses when she says, behold the maidservant of the Lord. Look at the way these saints look at themselves. I don't belong to me. I don't belong to my family. I don't belong to my church. I belong to who? I belong to God. The God I belong to. These are the words that St. Paul uses. It is very, very obvious that St. Paul prayed for his safety and the safety of all those that were with him, and God answered him because he's a saint. And I'm sure he answers his intercessions should we intercede through him. In verse 25 he gives them, he says, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told of me. This is the message that these men needed to be able to have faith in God, and this faith will give them peace. But St. Paul tells them, even though we're going to be safe, what's going to happen? The ship is not going to survive. It's going to be lost. And therefore we must err. We must run aground on a certain island. Verse 27. Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up, look at St. Luke and the words he used. 14 days, we are driven. We're not driving, we are driven. As we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. Now the sailors, with their experience, they can hear the waves, and they can hear as the waves break, whether they are leading or going towards land or not. Now this Sea of Adria refers to the central part of the Mediterranean Sea between Italy and Crete and the northern coast of Africa, if that gives you a picture of where that is. And these sailors, from their experience, they realized that they were approaching land. So what they're going to do is they're going to make soundings. And we see that in verse 28. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. What these soundings are, they're like a weight that they used to throw into the sea and would have different marks, and the marks tell them the depth of where the sea is. So it's like a measuring that tells you how deep you are. The fact that the depth is reducing means that they are approaching land. So these soundings are telling them there were 20 fathoms, then 15 fathoms, means that that the depth is getting less, which means they are approaching land. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. So fearing that they'd run at the ground, fearing that the ground is going to get lower and lower, the ship will hit the land. Basically, to throw the anchors is to put the brakes on the ship. It's like applying your ABS. They threw 4. And they prayed for day to come. Because if the ship was going to run aground, it would have been destroyed because it would have hit the rocks. And had they thrown all their anchors in the front of the ship, the ship would have turned amidst itself in these high winds and these high waves, which would have destroyed the ship. This is why they threw it to the back like I said, ABS brakes. And throwing for anchors gives us, to an extent, the kind of wind that this ship was trying to overcome. Gives us the kind of storm that they were suffering. And that kind of gives you this picture St. Luke is trying to tell us. This was a difficult experience. Verse 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, remember the skiff, the rescue boat that they reinforced, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. So here, the fact that they've done that means that the sailors were actually expecting the ship to drown at any time. So they have the rescue boat ready, so they can jump in the rescue boat the minute the ship drowns. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. Imagine that. Imagine that. Imagine cutting off the rescue boat of the big ship. See, St. Paul had a heavenly promise that he will survive. But the question comes, St. Paul, why didn't you use all available resources to you to survive? Without this rescue boat, or without this thing that directs the ship, we're going to have a problem. And here we can see how St. Paul was very wise. He didn't believe what the sailors said to escape. And sometimes we shouldn't stand with our hands tied if there's something that we can do. God assists us to save ourselves, but we need to assist our own selves in our salvation. These sailors were trying to take an easy way out and give up without having to work hard. Does this stand against the fact that St. Luke told us that they just let themselves be in God's hands? No. We do everything we can. But not give up and not run away. And as day, verse 33, and as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." Because St. Paul had faith, he had peace. Everybody else was not at peace, but it's obvious that he made everybody He made everybody fast. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. Here, he's telling them that you are, and reinforcing the fact that they will survive. And when we had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and took food themselves. And in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So again, we found that they're still working at trying to survive. They're still reducing the load of the ship. Taban, we're running out of time, but we can finish it. When it was day, verse 39, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile losing the rudder ropes. And they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore, but striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. So it was that they all escaped safely to land. St. Luke describes the end of this difficulty. They finally made it to land. But what we see was happening here, if you remember right at the beginning, I said to you, the centurion having experienced Paul. Here we see him saving Paul in verse 43. Why did the soldiers want to kill all the prisoners? Because there was no way the soldiers were going to keep hold of the prisoners. Ship is run offshore, ship is going to be destroyed. And the punishment for a soldier who loses a prisoner was severe. I think it was very, very severe. And to avoid losing the prisoners, they decided to kill them. But the centurion, having experienced the love of St. Paul, saved St. Paul, and in doing that, everybody was saved. And glory be to God forever and ever. Amen. Next week I'll just dwell on these last few verses quickly before chapter 28, and I don't think we'll finish chapter 28 in 1 week. It may need 2 weeks. We'll see how we go. I'm sorry, I know I keep postponing the end, but we can try. Any questions? Run away from the problem? Like?
So they were either running away from the problem and
Both of them are bad. Running away from God is not a solution. God in His mercy may seek us and bring us back, and He does, but it's not a solution. Yeah? But running away from the problem when there is something I can do about it, that's the wrong thing to do. And just because there are examples in the Bible of someone that may have done that, again, that's not the right example. St. Paul here gives us the right way of doing it. The right way of doing it is when the problem is bigger than my ability, I do what I can and let God do the rest. There's a beautiful saying that a lot of people say. Yeah, but I know. No, there's not. No. Facing a big problem, remind yourself that you have a bigger God. Yeah? Having said that, running away from sin is a different story. So if you're thinking of someone like Joseph, who ran away from Potiphar, it's running away from sin. And he had control to run away. Here we have St. Paul in the middle of the sea. Very little he can do. There was very little he can do. But to run away in this example that we have in our hands means that, okay, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to empty the ship. I'm not going to fast. I'm not going to pray. I'm doomed, I'm going to lock myself in a room, and that's how I'm going to deal with it. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the world sometimes do that, and that's not right. That's exactly what St. Paul did. He removed himself because he realized there's very little that he himself can do in this problem. That's why he had peace. He removed himself, and who did he put in the driving seat? He put God. And that's exactly what we need to do a lot of the times in a lot of these problems. Say to the big problem, I have a bigger God. I'm not the one that's going to deal with it. St. Luke goes out of his way saying we were driven. There's very little we could do to control that ship. The ship was in charge. Therefore, what did we do? We put God in charge. But in putting God to charge, we didn't go in and sleep. We emptied, we roped, we did everything we can. But everything was in the hands of God, not in our hands. And that's sometimes the hardest thing to do when we face difficulties. Hardest thing to do is to keep working what we can work, knowing and trusting that everything in God's hands. We find that difficult to do. This life of complete submission to God is difficult. Your question? Rescue boat. Absolutely not, because St. Luke tells us in a few verses after that he worked out that those sailors were trying to take the easy way out. They were trying to save themselves. It's obvious that those rescue boats weren't going to rescue the 270 odd. Paul had faith in the air message that came to him from who? From God. Everybody was going to be saved. Therefore, it wasn't only going to be the sailors in that boat. Yes? The sailors were just looking for themselves. Yes. Be still doesn't mean that I don't do anything. Paul was still. Look how peaceful he is. Look at the amount of confidence with which he says, I know you're going to all be saved. He says to them, come and eat. Stop fasting. It's okay. We're going to be saved. He's still. But there are practical aspects that still need to be completed. I still need to stand and pray. I still need to keep taking things off the ship and making the ship lighter. That doesn't take away from the stillness. Now see, we dig our own grave when we insist to keep in control. Digging our own grave is when we insist that we can solve it. When we insist and we search for, a lot of the time we look for human answers. There was no human answer to that problem. This is why, what did the sailors do? Paul, you sound crazy. We're all dying. We're going to escape. Yes. Yes, and that's what I said right at the beginning when he started saying we. It looked like he accompanied the prisoners and St. Paul. Not just him, and there was another guy right at the beginning from Thessalonica, a Macedonian guy. I struggled to say his name because, my reading is pretty bad. No, verse 2 I think it was. Yeah, here. Aristocratus. So Aristocratus and Luke accompanied Justus and the prisoners, including St. Paul. Well, I don't think the 270 were all prisoners. It doesn't tell us that they were all prisoners, but there were obviously, doesn't tell us how many prisoners there were, doesn't tell us how many other soldiers there were, but it's obvious that there were soldiers, there were prisoners, there was the centurion, and it could be that the centurion had 100 soldiers with him, because that's what a centurion led. And I don't know how many, if it's 100 prisoners, then that, if it's 1-to-1, that might be 200 out of the 274. Sailors and a few other people, because this, remember, this was a shipping line. This was a line that just transported wheat across. So it wasn't a line that had passengers as such, but it did have sailors. But what is obvious that is St. Paul wasn't under heavy guard. That's right, because there was no charge. Remember, there was no charge against him. Yeah? And let him have friends, because he wasn't a prisoner with a charge against him. He was someone that was, there's no charges laid against him until now, and we'll see the rest next week. You will see. It's next week. It's next week. Why does he end up being martyred? You'll find out. That's why I said we might not finish chapter 28 next week. Like, I thought 27 was going to finish quickly, and it took an hour and a bit. Yes. One of who? Which people? No, right at the beginning, right at the beginning, he let him see his friends, and it actually tells us that first port that they went to is Lebanon. So obviously, because Paul had been through his missionary trips, he knew people. Yeah. Yes. 59 AD.
No, I meant like as in to look after people.
And it could, yes, Mahna, we've already gone through that, yes, quite a few weeks ago. Yes. He still had the thorn in his back. St. Luke follows him the whole way. Yeah? And St. Luke wrote the book of Acts from beginning to end. Alright? He likes Luke because it's a name. I don't think so, no. And that's definitely not what my Bible commentary said. No, I don't think so. But we always give thanks. And the reason I don't think so is it doesn't tell us anywhere that he baptized them. So there's nowhere where it tells us that he baptized them. Keeping in mind, so what my commentary does actually say is that this is what Christ used to do. So when he fed the 5,000, he took bread and gave thanks. That's why everybody followed. This is why when we come to eat, we give thanks and then eat. This is normal food. Yeah. Whereas Last Supper was different, which is communion is different. No, he did what Christ did in the feeding of the 5,000. Took bread, gave thanks, and then gave it out. Different to communion. But you're right, the Bible, when it comes to communion, he says he took bread and gave thanks. But in this sense, no. All right? Can we pray?